All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation with Senator Peter Welch. My name is Jonathan Bogan, and I'm an ambassador for the Dartmouth Political Union. On behalf of the DPU, we want to thank you for joining us for today's event. The DPU is the preeminent student-led, nonpartisan political organization at Dartmouth College. We aim to promote open political discourse through fostering understanding and challenging preconceptions by inviting speakers from across the political spectrum and hosting student debates. Today's event is part of a series of events under the umbrella of the Democracy Summit that will seek to dive deeper into the issues and opportunities facing democracies both domestically and internationally from now through the end of the year. The Democracy Summit is a collaboration between the Dartmouth Political Union, the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy, and the Dickey Center for International Understanding. We have a roster of upcoming events that will be announced through this fall. We will be taking audience questions during the latter part of this event. So if you would like to ask a question to Senator Welch, there will be two of our amazing DPU ambassadors coming around with microphones. If you ask a question, please make sure to keep it brief. I would now like to welcome Senator Peter Welch. Senator Welch served in the Vermont Senate from 1981 to 1989 and 2003 to 2007, and was the first Democrat to become the Vermont Senate's president pro tempore. He served as a law clerk for Judge Henry Black of the Vermont Superior Court. Senator Welch has been a major figure in Vermont politics for over 4 decades and is only the second Democrat to be elected a U.S. Senator from the state. He has demonstrated his commitment to meaningful reform through a variety of ways of public advocacy, most notably participating in the 2016 House of Representatives sit-in to support comprehensive gun reform. He was elected to the U.S. Senate on November 8, 2022, and has continued to be an avid supporter of affordable education, climate change prevention, LGBTQ+ rights, and gun safety, including racial justice. And with that, I would now like to pass it on to our moderator, William Riker, founder of the Dartmouth Political Union.
Thank you so much to Senator Welch for joining us today. We're very honored to have you, especially on this side of the river, as you said. And I think we want to start it off if you wanted to give a brief introduction.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's really wonderful to be here, and it's nice weather outside. I'm wondering, because I thought you Dartmouth folks like to be outdoors more than indoors, but. You know, it's a pretty special thing for me to be here, because when I went to law school in Berkeley, and when I got out of law school, I traveled for 6 months. All my friends took the bar exam, and I bought a backpack. It was one of the first North Face backpacks, and I was intent on getting down to Santiago, Chile, and I was traveling with my girlfriend at the time, and she dumped me in Lima, and and I ended up down in Chile and over in Brazil. And when I returned, the question I had was, where am I going to go to work? And you know, I went to law school at Berkeley. Some of you may have that in the future for you. And the big question I had worked at a big firm in Washington, D.C., and you know, the usual route for my classmates was to work on Wall Street or K Street, and I ended up right here on Bridge Street in White River Junction. So it's good to be back home. And the thing, we're going to spend most of our time on questions, but it's going to be very interesting for me to hear what your own concerns are, but I'd really love to hear your aspirations, because when I was in college, it's really when I got interested in becoming a lawyer and interested in getting involved in politics. And what was significant for me, it was the civil rights era and the anti-war era for Vietnam. And there was an immense amount of activism in college then, protesting the war. And there was an immense amount of activism to get involved in the civil rights movement. And you mentioned, you know, the gun safety demonstration that we had. That was with John Lewis, which was one of the great honors of my time in Congress. But when I went to Holy Cross College down the road, and when I was in college, one summer I went out to Chicago because there was a Jesuit-inspired community organization that was starting, and it was affiliated with Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And I hitchhiked out to Chicago from Springfield, Massachusetts, and for the 4th of July weekend to find out what was going on. And my parents were pretty freaked out because they thought I'd get arrested, and it took me 20 hours in Chicago, and I did get arrested. And it was because the community organization, it was a Saul Alinsky modeled organization for any of you who know about the community organization. But it was in the West Side, Lawndale, very poor African-American community. And the whole concept of the organizing was to find out what people needed and then help mobilize for them to get it. And at that point, the garbage was not being picked up in Lawndale. It was outrageous. And what we did is got a couple of pickup trucks with a bunch of garbage cans, and we drove down to City Hall and we dumped it. And that was a problem. But what happened right after that is the following Monday, there was a caravan of city sanitation trucks coming out to literally do what was supposed to be done. I ended up dropping out of college and staying there for a year. And then after, I only went to college really 3 years. After a year, I then became a Robert Kennedy Fellow. It was after his assassination. And the family foundation basically was to provide a small stipend for about 35 young people around the country who were doing community organizing. And that little organization that we were in and started out with protesting the lack of sanitation pickup became what was known as the Contract Buyers League. And what that was a response to the outrageous redlining and discrimination that was being imposed on black folks moving into the neighborhood who could not buy a house the way everybody else bought a house. They couldn't get a mortgage even if they had the income to support it. They couldn't get their loan guaranteed by the VA, even though they were veterans in the same war as other folks who got those mortgages guaranteed. And banks would just redline altogether so people couldn't get a mortgage. The effect was that these families had to pay twice the market rate for the house because they had to buy it on contract. And the contract was one where if you missed a payment after 10 years, you got sick, you got laid off, something happened, you missed a payment, legally you could be thrown out and lose all your equity, okay? And what we did is we worked together and became community-led, but we organized after getting all the information. I spent a couple of months down in the city clerk's office with some of my classmates getting all the documentation so people saw what had happened. But eventually we had a payment strike. Eventually we got the banks to start lending money. We got the VA to change its policy. We got the FHA to change its policy. And the two things, and a lot of folks got their homes renegotiated, got the price lower, got the interest rate lower, and it made a huge, huge difference in their lives. But the two things that were the lesson to me that have stuck with me really throughout my life is one, when people organized and got together and shared a goal and worked together, they could actually make things change. It was important, and it was a real community-led effort. The second thing was the realization that this discrimination, this outrageous treatment of people, most of what was happening was legal. At that time, it was legal to deny a person a mortgage because they lived in an area. It was legal for the VA to deny insurance to a person on the basis of the color of their skin. So it's what led me to have a real interest both in law, because we had a lot of lawyers who volunteered and helped us get the contract law changed, helped us in our court battles, helped us in our eviction battles. And it also got me interested in politics, because the laws make a difference. They really do. So that was really sort of what got me started. And I ended up in Vermont, and then a few years later ran for the state Senate. And you mentioned I was out of politics for a little while. I was in the Senate two different times in between. A lot of people say I took a break. It's called losing an election, all right? So I did take a break. So anyway, I'll be interested in hearing your stories and what it is you'd like to do. Now I'm in Washington. I served in Congress for 16 years. I'm in the Senate now. We're at a really precarious time in our country. As you know, I was in the building on January 6th. I was about 20 feet from where the shot was fired. I was in the gallery right above where the mob was breaking the doors down. You saw those iconic pictures of the guards down there barricading those doors. And as bad as that was, and as scared as many of us were, we had to come back at 3 in the morning to certify the election of President Biden. And it's just a functionary thing. You show up, Vermont voted for Biden. My obligation is to acknowledge that Vermont voted for Biden. It's not a discretionary thing. And my worst and most bitter and painful experience in politics in all the years I've been, state or federal, was when 147 of my colleagues voted against certifying the President of the United States. So it was a real use of violence in the Capitol in an effort to thwart the peaceful transfer of power. And our whole democracy has always depended on the right of people, not the politician, to elect who the leaders are. And there's always been a willingness to have the peaceful transfer of power that's been like our birthright. And what I remember most vividly about January 6th, even as the mob was breaking the doors down, was I couldn't believe it was happening. I was there, and I didn't believe it was happening because this was the United States of America. So, we got through that, but it's not behind us. It's really a precarious situation that we have. It is so essential for us that we maintain our democracy because it's the tool that we absolutely need for all of us to be at the table to deal with the challenges we face, like on climate change. So many of you have been real active on civil rights, on income inequality, on a healthcare system that is too expensive and not giving people access to the care that they need. So I'll just end by expressing to you my appreciation that you're having these discussions and you're coming and you're getting engaged. And lastly, there's a lot of Dartmouth folks hanging around the U.S. Senate. Tina Smith, she went to Tuck. Rob Portman, who just retired but was a very, very, very highly respected member of the U.S. Senate. Who else?
Angus King?
Oh my God, Angus King is such a wonderful man. He got a flat tire, and the person who picked him up became his wife. That's true. When he was at Dartmouth. That's a true story. And who else is there?
And then John Hoeven.
And John Hoeven, yeah, who I don't know so well. We're getting to know each other now.
Got himself lost in the
Pardon
cornfields.
me?
Got himself lost in the cornfields of North Dakota.
So that's like 4 Dartmouth alums are in the U.S. Senate. I don't know whether I'm
Kirsten
there,
Gillibrand.
so I know what the story is. So I'm not sure you should be so proud, but it's pretty good.
And then Kirsten Gillibrand as well.
And Kirsten, yeah, and she, I'm going to co-sponsor with her. She's really tremendous on a lot of things, but agriculture and the nutrition program. A lot of folks want to cut the nutrition program, and I just came from Killington, where there were about 150 folks around Vermont who work in food shelves and local kitchens and are doing everything they can, and the need for food is up, even though COVID is behind us. But Kirsten introduced legislation to basically put in 30% additional into nutrition, and I'm co-sponsoring that with her and quite proud of it. But she's a tremendous Dartmouth alum as well.
Well, we're very grateful to have you here today, and we want to. I think we want to take the time to, ask you a couple questions, both on your path to the Senate and your path to the halls of Congress, as well as national politics and questions of our democracy and questions that have come before you and are going to come before you in the Senate. And then, just as a Vermonter, I also wanted to spend a little bit of time, talking about some issues that are facing Vermont.
Sure.
And so I think I want to start by asking about your background a little bit, because as you said, you grew up in the 1960s with a strong connection to social justice and a penchant for activism, including working with a lot of low-income people on the west side of Chicago and attending meetings of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with speeches by Martin Luther King and
Right,
Ralph
that was
Abernathy,
amazing.
Jose Williams. And so I wonder, and then you also became a public defender when you
Right.
moved to Vermont in the state of, in Windsor and Orange counties, if I'm
Right.
correct. So I wonder,
Get
you know,
prepared.
which of these experiences, you know, do you think have had the greatest impact on your time in Congress? And, you know, how do you think those experiences have informed some of your work in Congress?
Well, I was telling you about Chicago was pretty informative for me. You know, I was a sophomore, so I'm young. And you know, in high school, my world was all around my great athletic career. I was the point guard on the championship basketball team, and that was the most important thing. And the farther I am away from having been on that team, the memory of my career is ever more glorious. but you know, I went to Catholic schools growing up, and in the Catholic, you know, there's sort of two things in the Catholics. There's some that are the social justice conscience wing, and some that are the doctrine and obedience wing. And I was in the former. And I have a sister who's a nun. She's been a nun for 52 years, and she's like the most modern person I know. All right, you know, Peter, get with it. You know. But there was kind of a social awareness, I think, gene that my mom had a lot, and there was a lot of acceptance in her. And you know, some of these things about I'm saying about my parents, you know, you'll be seeing your parents differently. As much as you care for them now, you'll start to, and certainly with me, my appreciation for her capacity to accept people and listen. But the most formative was definitely being in Chicago, where we were encouraging people. You know, I knew the cause was righteous. It was just unbelievable to me that a person was denied homeowner insurance because they were black. I mean, you can't. It's like shocking. When I was your age, I was just so shocked I didn't even know what to do with it, because I thought just pointing out that there's discrimination would result in the elimination of discrimination, because who could be for something that's so patently unfair? But as you start to learn, there's these structures in place where people get explanations or emotional attachments as well as material attachments to a status quo kind of condition. And how do you change? And when we started the Contract Buyers League, and we went from demonstrations to picketing, to going out to the neighborhood where the contract sellers lived, and we had fact sheets about what that person was doing and how they were making their money. And you know, this was a shaming kind of deal, where we knock on the doors of the neighbors, and the whole idea was to get these people, the contract owners, to come to the bargaining table and let us get fair prices. But eventually we actually had payment strikes. And I was a junior in high school, or pardon me, college, and I was terrified. And I wasn't terrified physically. I was terrified. I realized I was encouraging some families who had kids to take an action where they may lose their house. And it kind of made me cautious and careful. I mean, I knew the cause was righteous, but there was no guarantee that the outcome was going to be good. Yet on the other hand, people were making the decisions that it was worth making the risk to stand up for themselves and for their neighbors. So that was a searing experience for me, that I was this young person who had no, you know, I didn't have anything at risk, but I was encouraging folks to take a risk where there was incredible consequences if it didn't work out. So it's always kind of tempered me a little bit, you know, not in my advocacy or not in my sense of urgency, but my appreciation that it's one thing for you to decide you want to take a risk. It's quite another to be cavalier if you're encouraging other people to do it as well. So.
Well, thank you. You spent a lot of time as a member of the House of Representatives, starting in 2006. And, you know, probably because of, you know, being informed by your experience with activism, you've been known as a very stalwart progressive. But you were also, it seems like not afraid to take on certain occasions decisions to work with Republican members, and even in some cases to go against your own party. And so some examples that come to mind for me include your work with Representative Eric Cantor on
Right.
pediatric cancer research, or your work with former Representative David McKinley on supporting coal miners. And so I wonder, what has been your experience, working across the aisle, working with Republicans, many of whom, you disagree with fundamentally on a number of issues?
Yeah. Well, politics is about trying to get things done and make improvements, right? And, you have your value. There's things you believe on macro issues, tax policy, the budget. We're going to have those battles. There's core issues about civil rights where you really can't compromise, but you've got to find ways to make progress. So, there'll be times when it's a vote you have to make where if you're going to be true to yourself and your ideals are going into politics, you've got to be willing to really make an act of conscience. I didn't have to vote on the Vietnam War, but the folks who did, I really admire the ones who took the lead. So here's the dichotomy. There's issues of real principle, like do you vote for marriage or not, okay? And you've got to do the right thing there, regardless of what the electoral consequences are. And if it's a tough vote because the people that sent you to Congress, let's say, they're not undecided about it, they're hostile to it or whatever, your job then is to do the best you can to engage the people you represent and tell them why you think this is the right thing to do. There's all kinds of other things in politics where the capacity of the political system to make a difference is there if you know how to work and find ways to work with other people. I'll give another concrete example, broadband. We had really lousy broadband in Vermont. It's getting better now. But before the pandemic, there was a lot of Trump folks in Congress, and especially from rural areas, and Vermont's a rural area. So I would interact with my Republican colleagues, not by saying, why in the world did you vote for Trump? I'd ask them, how's broadband in your in your district? Well, then we have a conversation. We're talking about broadband. And you know what? Vermonters need broadband. The folks in Kansas needed broadband. Well, suddenly we're talking about something concrete instead of something abstract and ideological. And I created the Broadband Caucus. We had about 20 Republicans and 20 Democrats, and we began advocating for more and more money for broadband. And we had a real hard time with our urban counterparts who kind of blew us off, basically, because the broadband was way better there than it was here. But by getting that group together on both sides of the aisle on that specific issue where we really had unity, we were able to get results. And then, of course, COVID came, and it really made the argument, because at that point, kids at home couldn't go to school without broadband. Parents oftentimes couldn't work. A lot of times you couldn't get a medical appointment unless you were able to do telehealth. So the way I approach things is to be concrete. What do Vermonters need? And by and large, a lot of the things that we need are not unique to red state, blue state deal. I mean, a lot of things we need now. We need more affordable health care. We need child care. We need paid family leave. We need kids being able to go to college without getting out with a mountain of debt. And, that's not specific to what your politics are. That's just like what families need these days. Housing. These are a lot of the challenges you're going to face as you go out from college here, which you face, in that respect, a lot steeper challenges than I faced when I graduated from college. So I find it very easy to work with folks by starting on something that we share and just accepting the fact that there's some things I'm not going to be able to persuade them about, okay? But that's why when I mentioned it was very painful for me when 147 of my colleagues voted against certifying the election of President Biden, to me, that's one of those votes where you just got to do the right thing. There's not room to manage that, all right? That's like core to the Constitution. It's core to our democracy. And a lot of those folks who voted against certifying the president were people I'd worked with, had affection with, and respected. And that was hard, because that was one of those, pardon me, really consequential, principled votes where I think you got to do the right thing, whatever the cost.
Well, thank you. I think continuing on this theme of bipartisanship, I wanted to ask you about something that is coming up and is probably going to require quite a bit of bipartisanship, which is that June 1st is a big date, less than a month away, and it seems as if that is when the Treasury Department has told us we will be hitting the debt ceiling. And a few days ago, House Republicans passed a measure that would raise the debt ceiling, but in exchange for cutting a number of programs, including climate programs, including the Inflation Reduction Act, and making a lot of requirements for work for social benefits. And so my question for you is, is the recent House Republican debt ceiling proposal a non-starter for Senate Democrats, or do you believe there's room for negotiation? And a follow-up to that, which is, how worried are you right now that Congress will not be able to reach an agreement in time?
Two things. First of all, this word bipartisan. I work with Republicans all the time, and I've worked with people I disagree with all the time, and I kind of like it. You can be clear where you are, you understand where they are, and you try to find where there's some common ground to move ahead. And when I was state Senate president, I appointed Republicans to chair major committees. When I tell my colleagues in Washington that I did that, they literally think I need a mental status exam, right? And then they make the most vile of accusations against me. They say I'm a good guy, right? It had nothing to do with being a good guy. It had to do with an appreciation that if a person was in the minority, had a seat at the table and felt that they were really heard and you could get somewhere, then when you actually got a result, it would be durable. And that was my history. In fact, when I first went to the state Senate, I won this big upset race in Windsor County. We basically never had a Democrat. It was a year of the Reagan landslide, and I won. And I get there, and I'm kind of thinking I'm a big shot. I just won this upset race. I'm ready to cause trouble here. And the Republican leaders, these wonderful Vermonters, I said, I want to be on the Finance Committee. Well, that's a stretch. When you're the new member, they put me on the Finance Committee. And I knew from that moment I was doomed, because it meant I had to contribute and work as opposed to just raise hell. And it's kind of a lesson I've taken with me through politics and through life. On this question of the debt ceiling, first of all, you guys all know that raising the debt ceiling has nothing to do with more spending, right? We all understand that? All right. And there was a decision that was made by Alexander Hamilton. We had just won our independence, and we were broke. And there were a lot of people, for some reason or other, that bought bonds to help us finance the revolution. When we came out of it, those bonds had deteriorated in value, so they were worth pennies on the dollar. And Alexander Hamilton and the New Republic had to make a decision. Do we get out of town and just pay pennies on the dollar, or do we pay 100 cents on the dollar? Alexander Hamilton made the decision that we pay our bills. Full faith and credit. That's been true in this country since it began. We're now literally having a discussion in Congress that makes it an option for us to stiff our creditors. And my view, that's not negotiable. It's not we pay our bills when due and on time. Two reasons. Number one, there's enormous benefit to us as a country that we have the dollar that is the strong currency that it is. In significant part, it is because it is like cash. And there's like $8 trillion of our $31 trillion debt that's owned by foreigners. And they, in effect, by having such confidence in the dollar, lower the amount of interest that we would have to pay. So there's a real benefit to have that credibility. The second thing is it's a catastrophe if we default. Because what it means, you know, some of you might have a money market account. That dollar that you assume is $1, it might become 95 cents. Because a lot of that money market is invested in treasury bills. They can lose value as a result of the downgrade from AAA. And the repercussions in the financial markets are enormous. So there's the using as a serious threat that you're going to default as a way to get your will is, in my view, out of bounds. You can't do that. And throughout the history of the country, we've always raised the debt ceiling to make certain that we can pay our bills. You know, it's very much like you have a mortgage or you have a car payment and you decide you're sick of it and you're not going to pay it. You can do that. It doesn't end well, okay? And that's where we're heading now. Now, the second thing about this, there is a question of our debt. How are we going to deal with it? And that's a fair and square discussion. And some people think we should spend more, some people think less, some people think big cuts, and others not. My view is that to deal with the debt, you've got to do it over a sustained period of time, and you've got to get the growth of the debt more corresponding to the growth in the economy, so you bring that curve down, and that takes, you know, a plan and implementation over time. And I'm willing to do that, but what I'm not willing to do is default on the debt. And what's different now is, than in the past, you know, whether it was Trump, we were in Congress when Trump was president, we raised the debt ceiling. Trump thought it was bizarre to threaten not to, although I don't know what he'd say today. Ronald Reagan was against even suggesting we would not pay our bills. What would happen, what's different now is that there's folks in the House Republican Party that don't think there'll be bad consequences if we default. They just don't believe it. And, you know, that's kind of crazy because it's like wishful thinking and fantasy thinking. So the answer, am I worried? I'm very worried. And if you saw Mitch McConnell is not going to get involved in negotiations, he's a very shrewd politician. He's not getting involved because he knows he can't add anything. The House Republicans hate him, and they don't want to do anything other than get what it is they passed in the House. So I'm extremely worried about this because you've got a group of members on the House Republican side who are prepared to go over the cliff. So I'm worried. I'm really worried. Now, what will happen ultimately is if we do default, there'll be violent market reaction. And it will force us to do belatedly what we should have done a long time ago, and that is raise the debt ceiling so we can continue to pay our bills.
Do you see that as the most realistic solution or the most realistic outcome of this?
That's not a solution, that's a failure.
Or
But I'm seeing the odds of failure on raising the debt ceiling in a timely way so we don't create economic disruption in a potential recession as is growing every day. And it's the cast of characters I'm working that are in the House. I mean, you had Adam Kinzinger here. Were some of you here with him? All right, he's quite conservative compared to me. Okay, he believes in democracy. And he would not, and he also will assess consequences. He won't just wave it away. And what's happened, and I don't want to sound partisan on this, but the kind of the Rob Portman Republican Party is not in control in the House of Representatives. I mean, I don't know how many of you met Senator Portman, but you know, very highly regarded senator, both sides of the aisle, in conservative, but believed in the principles of democracy, believed in arithmetic, you know, believed in gravity, and he also believed in paying your bills. I mean, this would never happen. But it's not at all clear that what's happened in the past, that is, at the last minute we get it resolved, will happen this time.
Well, thank you. I think it's an issue that we're definitely going to have to keep watch on as the clock ticks down. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and ask you a little bit about foreign policy. So during your tenure in the House, you were a strong advocate for ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and during the Obama administration, you opposed U.S. military involvement in Syria under Obama. So from these positions, it seems to me as if you are in favor of a more restrained U.S. presence abroad. So I wonder if any of these views have changed at all in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and our support for the Ukrainians, as well as increasing tensions with China over Taiwan. So overall, do you see a potential emerging great power rivalry with Russia and China as compelling reasons for American diplomatic and military re-engagement with the world?
Well, there's a lot of conflicting elements in that question. I'm against dumb wars, okay? What in the world were we doing in Vietnam? Seriously. What were we doing in Iraq? Why were we nation building in Afghanistan? That's the question. And we had, in Vietnam, has anybody here been to Vietnam? Yeah, it's a beautiful country. It's beautiful people. And the first time I went there, I went with Senator Leahy. I was like, why, how in the world did we get ourselves so convinced that these people in Vietnam were a threat to us in New Hampshire and in Vermont? And of course, it was the domino theory, right? And then it becomes domestic politics. But the tragedy of that war, that's seared on me. This is about making a judgment about should we have some kind of military involvement in Vietnam. And history's pretty clear at this point that was a tragic war for us. And then, in Iraq, when Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11, and there was total lying about the weapons of mass destruction. And this makes me heartsick because I am working with a lot of veterans, in Vietnam, some of my high school friends went and didn't come back. And it was a searing time for all of us who were your age, basically, getting a student deferment. And you feel bad even about that because you had friends you went to high school with and they didn't get a deferment. You're sitting here, at school. But then in Iraq, a lot of Vermonters went there. In fact, we had the highest percentage per capita population that died in the early Iraq phases of the war. And I remember early on going to a funeral of a kid who graduated from Hartford High School. And right after he got out of high school, he was in Fallujah and he got killed. And I'm there with his classmates, and it's a service for him. But what is so powerful to me about that was the war was based on, no weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11, right? Thousands of people, young people, idealistic people, including a lot of Vermonters, would defer to the decision of the policymakers, and if we, or the president called them to go to war, they loved their country and they wanted to serve and they had ideals, and of course they get over there and everything turns out to be different. And here's the thing that's so hard, especially for me meeting all these folks who served us so well and who I so admire in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're over there in this war. We lowered taxes. It was invisible to America that these kids getting out of high school, some out of college, were in these battles. Some came back maimed. All came back damaged and injured for what they had to go through. And they come back to a country where people didn't even know they were gone. So they're isolated with this incredible experience, and you wonder why there's so much PTSD. And there's the high suicide rate among our veterans. It's terrible. But we've asked them to go through this experience totally isolated when the country didn't even, raise taxes to pay for the war. And there's a hypocrisy here. So, the biggest question, the most profound vote anyone will make is, do you go to war or not? In Afghanistan, we took on nation building. Osama bin Laden was there, safe haven. I'd be supportive of bombing him, the camps or whatever, but not nation building. I'll just give you a story about how bizarre it got. There was a lot of corruption, as you know. You read about these big planes taking pallets of cash that were shrink wrapped to Dubai. Well, the Justice Department sent over a team of lawyers to teach the Afghan civil servants how to detect corruption. After 4 months, they had to disband the unit because the people who were taught how to detect corruption started doing corruption. All right? So there was an arrogance here about this capacity we had to do the nation building. So that's why I just want to be clear here. You've got to take each thing specifically. And the decisions that the politicians made on Vietnam, the decisions the politicians made on Iraq and Afghanistan are what I condemn. And what's so searing to me is the prices paid by a lot of young idealistic people who want to be out there for their country. And then to see the struggles they have with PTSD, where they are living that, and none of us can share that experience, so they're isolated. So Ukraine, just to get next to Ukraine, it's totally different. I'm totally supportive of the U.S. doing all we can with military aid, with humanitarian aid, and obviously with diplomatic engagement to help Ukraine fight to defend itself. And what's so totally different there, obviously, is you have a partner who's defending themselves from an invasion. So I'm very supportive of what we're doing right now on a bipartisan basis, largely in Ukraine. So,
does that support extend to Taiwan as well?
Taiwan's different. I mean, that's a real puzzle. And the real goal in Taiwan is to make sure we don't get into a conflict on it. I mean, we have this fig leaf policy with Taiwan, as you know, the two what is that called? What is that called? It makes such little, real sense that it's eluding me. The two China policy. I mean,
the one China, but and then in Hong Kong they had two systems.
Yeah,
like that.
You know what? I'm getting somewhat concerned. We have a competition with China. We have conflict with China, and we also need some cooperation with China. And China, in my view, has become significantly more authoritarian under Xi Jinping, right? There's very little question about that. But the worst thing that could possibly happen is that we talk ourselves into a major war with China. That's an absolute catastrophe. So the question for me on China, and it's delicate, it's long term, but we had this with the Soviet Union. We had a Cold War with the Soviet Union for years, right? Where the risk of nuclear war was significant, but there were times where we were in conflict. There were times where we tried to find ways to cooperate, and we were always somewhat in competition. And I think we've got to do that with respect to China. And what I'm seeing in Congress is a lot of my colleagues really focus on the conflict. There are things that we can do to be competitive, like this CHIPS Act that we just passed to try to bring chip manufacturing back to the U.S. is smart. I think that's a good thing to do, because we're not then dependent on the supply chain. I think we still have to engage where we can on climate issues with China, because that's essential and it's beneficial to all of us. And then there'll be areas where we have conflict. But the management has to be about trying to make certain that this doesn't become a hot war. And Taiwan is a big flashpoint, and that continues to be a work in progress. But I think that we don't want to overdo the rhetoric here, because the consequences if we get into a war with China are just catastrophic for all of us.
Thank you. I think we have a lot more. We could discuss and want to talk about. What I think I want to do, just very briefly, is a so-called lightning round of just a couple of questions on various topics where I wanted to pick your brain a little bit. And then we'll, after that, move on to audience Q&A.
Okay.
The first question for the lightning round is about climate change, and especially how climate change is impacting Vermont, which is, I can see coming from where I grew up in the Mad River Valley that climate change has a massive impact on not only the state, but where I live specifically.
Right.
If snow doesn't fall, ski areas don't open, and then,
Right.
the entire economy of the valley is in threat. But what do you think that Vermont's responsibility is for the effects of climate change, and how can the state itself be doing better to combat these threats, knowing that, while our overall emissions are quite small, on a per capita basis, we're one of the highest in the country, especially because, we live in such a rural area, and there's a lot of private vehicle use and a lot of fuel used for home heating. So are there areas where you see Vermont can be doing better?
Well, I want to challenge a little bit the question here. There are things all of us can do individually that are within our power to do. Okay, if you can get an electric car, that's great. You can recycle. All right, you can turn the heat down. You can drive 60 instead of 75. And I actually think all of us should do what we can to make our contribution. When it comes to public policy, that's where you've really got to make the changes so that we have options. So, it's fine if you can afford an electric car, but most people can't. A lot of Vermonters who need trucks, they can't get an electric F-150. So, yes, each of us individually can do what we can, but what one person is able to do, like say buy an electric vehicle, is different than what another person may do who may like to buy an electric vehicle but can't afford it. And that's why public policy is absolutely essential, because what you've got to do is make clean energy choices accessible and affordable. All right? As opposed to give people a lecture. Because, all of us should do what we can, so I don't want to wave that away. But telling somebody who really doesn't have that practical option, that's just being sort of self-righteous, in my view. It's why the Inflation Reduction Act, which, by the way, would be repealed under this House bill, that gets repealed, just so you know. It's the first time in our country's history where there has been real money, about $500 billion, a lot of incentives behind giving people options and companies options to move into a clean energy direction. And what's so significant about it is the private market is responding, because eventually the market has to be there. So you're seeing the auto dealers or the auto manufacturers really moving towards electric. And the more electric vehicles that get manufactured, the lower the cost is going to be. It's like with solar and solar panels. The prices come down like 90%. So that's where public policy is absolutely so essential. What the state of Vermont can do is different than what the federal government can do, okay? And I'm somebody who thinks that there's always got to be a real focus on making it affordable so that it's a real option for people, as opposed to telling them it's, quote, the right thing to do and it's what they should do. Because in most families here, it's tough for families in Vermont. They've got a couple of kids, they're trying to figure out how to pay the expenses, grocery prices are up, you know what's happening to housing prices. So public policy is really what makes a difference. And this is the existential challenge, I think, for your generation. It's so bad. We're at that tipping point. Some people think we're past it, and we've got to get going and fast to try to change it. But it's got to be done through not just the individual choices that you make that are within reach for you to make. It's got to be public policy that it really gets the market accelerating the options for clean energy. And by the way, it's really working. There's like $150 billion in private market investment. There's 46 new factories that have been built. There's like 180,000 jobs that have been created in response to the incentives that are out there. So that's what gives me some optimism. But the battle continues. I mean, literally, we had the House pass a bill that would repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, and all this progress that's in the process of being made would be halted in its tracks.
Thank you. I think one final question for our lightning round.
I wasn't so lightning quick on that. Sorry.
And I wanted to ask, I would be remiss, standing or sitting underneath a large sign called the Democracy Summit if I didn't ask about some of the ongoing threats to our democracy. We currently live in an era of polarization and gridlock, with, it seems like, a bitterly divided House of Representatives and a weak Speaker of the House, Supreme Court that appears to be losing legitimacy by the day, challenges to voting rights, continued influence of money in politics, the ongoing threat of white supremacy, political violence, and a growing sense that our country's politicians can't solve our problems anymore. So which of these do you see as which of these issues do you worry about the most? And where do you believe we can find the common ground that's going to be necessary to tackle some of these challenges?
You left out social media.
So, but my phone's been buzzing in my pocket this entire time.
I think democracy is pretty fragile now, and first of all, we saw what happened in 2020, and we came very close to losing it. It's really quite shocking. The political process is corrupted by big money, and we have a campaign finance system where literally billionaires can fund candidates without having to disclose they're sending the money into it. I mean, it's so different than when I started. I ran in 2006. It was the last election before Citizens United. And it was a very contested race here. I had a very good Republican opponent. Her name was Martha Rainville. She was the adjutant general, first female adjutant general in Vermont. And she was ahead of me most of the race. And I think what ultimately won it for me was the Iraq War. Vermont was against it. But she and I, in the beginning of the campaign, sat down and had a handshake that we wouldn't run negative ads against either one. I wouldn't run against her, she wouldn't run against me. That's the last contested congressional race in the history of this country that had no negative advertising. Now, if Martha and I were running against each other now and we wanted to make the same agreement, we couldn't do it. We could do it. But so much of the money that came into the campaign would be Citizens for a Just Tomorrow, It'd be like Coke money coming in or some other money. And they would be deciding whether to put money in here if they thought they had a chance of picking up a seat to get a majority in the House. It wouldn't be about Vermont. It wouldn't be about the issues. It would be about, is this one we can pick off? And then pre-Citizens United, if Martha ran a negative ad against me or I ran a negative ad against her, you would have known it was me and I broke my promise. Because her committee, the Republican Campaign Committee and the Democratic Campaign Committee, they were both telling us to run negative ads because that's what works, right? But neither of us did, and they were the only ones that could spend outside money. Neither one of them did because we had been so public about not doing it that whoever ran the first negative ad was going to pay a big price. That's gone with Citizens United. Social media is an incredible killer. We're just seeing how the capacity for misinformation, conspiracy theories, is just unreal. And you all have grown up with that in a way that I haven't. But it's very, very powerful. The breakdown of the parties is significant. And then I also think that the income inequality in this country is a really severe problem because a lot of folks are getting left behind. There's folks that are in the new economy and are doing well. But there's a lot of folks that no matter how hard they work, they're not getting there. And the last thing is the Supreme Court's a problem. It's a big problem. And the reason it is, it's not just these ethical issues that are now very much in the news. And I'm on the Judiciary Committee, and we had the hearing on this question of whether the Supreme Court should have a code of ethics. I mean, first of all, can I just ask a question? Is that a bizarre question or what? No, seriously. We've got 850 judges in the United States, right? Federal courts. Every single one of them is subject to, and willingly and quite delighted to be subject to, a strict code of ethics, including reporting and transparency. There's 9 of those 850 who are not subject to it, literally, right? So that's a problem. And it's a problem when the Chief Justice who's invited to come in basically blows us off. But there's another issue with the Supreme Court. The vetting process supposedly goes through the Judiciary Committee. Senator Leahy served on that, I think, his entire time in Congress. If you want to be, when you have a Republican president, if you are going to be a person who might be considered for the Supreme Court, the vetting process did not take place in the Judiciary Committee. It took place in the Federalist Society. You basically had to run the gauntlet to be providing assurance, lately, that you had what it took to overturn Roe v. Wade. I mean, just think about this. It's the first time in the history of our country that we've taken away a constitutional right through the Supreme Court. I mean, it's awful. Everyone here, I'm assuming, is just dreadful. In the conflict that it's created and how it's unleashed folks who not only want to have the right to make their own decision, they want the right to impose their decision on others. That's what's happening. But that was, 3 of those justices basically said they'd uphold precedent, and then they broke it, right? And they went through that gauntlet, but it wasn't the Judiciary Committee. It was that outside money that set up the Federalist Society. So what's happening with the court is they're interfering, in my view, with the legislature in its capacity to pass laws that reflect what the majority of people want. We can't interfere in the right of the decisional process. We, the legislature, can't interfere with the decisional process of the court. That's the separation of powers, even if we don't like the decision. But when the court starts encroaching on the capacity of the elected representatives of the people to pass legislation, like on gun safety legislation, as they did in the Bruin case in New York, where they struck down a New York law protecting folks against handguns. Like really with what they are doing on voting rights, where they're making facts up that there's no longer a discrimination issue in some of these districts, like they did in Citizens United, where they essentially asserted as a fact something that is totally and patently wrong, and that is that large contributions can't corrupt. No, they said that. So what they did in each case was restrict the elected body from being able to act on legislation that represents a majority point of view. People want gun safety. People want money out of politics. People want reproductive choice. So that's a big problem, beyond the ethics. That goes to the democracy issue.
Well, thank you. I think that will conclude the lightning round and the moderator-guided question and answer. And we are now going to open it up to audience Q&A. So there will be one of our fantastic ambassadors, Grace, coming around with a microphone. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. And remember to keep your questions brief, please.
Okay. Hello, my name is Jordan. I wanted to ask about apathy, that in this time of money in politics and of a divided House and Senate in which the Republican Party has seemingly given up any hope of bipartisanship and instead tried to attack the very root of our democracy and the systems of institutional power like the filibuster prevent Democrats, even when they do theoretically have power, from implementing the systematic change necessary to deal with problems like climate change? How do you get people to continue to have hope, to continue to try, to continue to fight for a better future when the systems of power are built to make us feel hopeless?
You know, you speak for a lot, I think, of people, probably in this room, but certainly in your generation. And I'll tell you how I kind of contended with that, because I have vivid memories of some of my friends saying something very similar in the height of Vietnam and civil rights, where, we were just dismayed. It's different now. It's the affordability crisis that you face. The planet's burning up. But at a certain point, you kind of make an existential decision. And it's not so much that you can have a pathway where that's going to all change, but you can decide you're going to get engaged and do what you can. And for me, the basic decision came down to, it was more fun being involved. It's like I just, let's get out there, let's do things, let's see what can happen. And, it's like when I went to Chicago, and everything you just said, that emotion, the whole power structure was, it was powerful. It was shocking to me that it was so powerful in the service, in my view, of a lot of evil that was happening and hardship that was imposing. But, the inspiration I got is here I am, a college kid, and I'm working with these families. The folks I was working with that had these homes, they were, in their 30s and 40s. And they had kids and they had real responsibilities. And what I was always amazed at was their capacity to get up and face the day and have a lot of love in them and a lot of forgiveness in them. And, I did meet Martin Luther King. We went down to Atlanta, and I remember we went to the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and he spoke, as you mentioned, and Ralph Abernathy, he spoke, and Hosea Williams spoke. And then, I was this white kid from Springfield, Massachusetts, and I then hear Martin Luther King. I mean, you can imagine what that was like for me. And after he gave his sermon, the church emptied out. And I saw him going upstairs, and I went upstairs and followed him, and he was doing a press conference about the war in Vietnam. And then, as you know, when he got assassinated, he was in Memphis standing up for garbage striking workers. Well, the folks I met in Chicago who were in such jeopardy and such victims of injustice, their capacity for forgiveness and for acceptance, and to face the day and to love their kids, that was pretty inspiring. So I thought, you know what, that sounds good to me. I'll get through life a little better if I have more of that attitude. So it's not like an answer, it's just a disposition,
Thank you.
Let's go down.
No, I think we should. It's okay. No, go
You can go.
ahead.
We'll get to them.
Quick question. Thank you for being here first, Peter.
All right, just going to stretch
on the-
my legs here.
Building a little bit on the social media, I look
Yeah.
at AI, at artificial intelligence, and think this is a thing that could radically accelerate
Right.
the dissemination of misinformation, because it's going to make it so much more
Right.
effective. All right, is the Senate, or are you all thinking a little bit about how to regulate or pause? There's a recent pause that voluntarily, but what should you do about?
None of us know. Everyone's worried, and none of us know. We actually had there was just an invitation that Dick Durbin put out to have a discussion about this, and on their own, 20 senators showed up. So it's an indication of how acute this concern is. I mean, this is going faster than anybody can keep up with, and none of us know what the implications are, but we know we have no control over it. So a lot of folks are thinking maybe we have to at least try to identify what the risks are or what the issues are that are at stake, and how best to have some kind of process that allows for public concerns to be at the forefront rather than after the fact. I mean, social media, remember, I mean, this is the kind of nightmare scenario. Social media, they got Section 230 exemption. You guys know what that is? No matter what they did, they wouldn't get sued because it wasn't on their platform. Of course, then they get the algorithms so that somebody puts something bad on there, the algorithm accelerates it, gets it all over the place. Well, we didn't anticipate what this would do to the mental health of kids. You know, 1 in 3 teenage girls contemplate suicide. I mean, that's really a disaster. So what can happen with AI? So we're concerned about that, Elliot.
I'll give it Quinn.
Hey, thank you so much for coming. This has been
Good to
really
be
cool
here.
to hear about. On the topic of like housing policy in the future, you have a very storied past on like Section 8 housing and implementing different forms and voucher programs. I want to know what you thought the future of housing policy was, especially as like high density housing is looking to be pushed through but constantly rejected, especially by people who live in the areas and NIMBYism in general. What is the most effective format you see going forward with housing policy?
Well, you know, there's two things. There's the cost of it that's really affected by, you know, what kind of federal support is there. But there's also the local issues, and it's all been NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. And there's a lot of pushing now for YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. And the Vermont, so housing is a combination of federal support, basically through tax credits and money. But there has to be a major local role about zoning. You know, most of the housing is zoned, or most of the country is zoned for single-family residence, and that just won't work. So Vermont is doing a lot right now to try, at the state level, to put some restrictions on the kind of exclusionary zoning that is making the housing crisis much more expensive.
I think we've got time for just a couple more questions. So,
Thank you so much. My name is Mac Mahoney, and I'm also from Springfield, Massachusetts, so go 413.
Where?
Well, I'm from like Ludlow, so not technically Springfield, but I claim it.
You got an interstate exit there.
Yeah, exactly, exit 7. So I don't agree with you politically on a lot of issues, but I have a lot of respect for you and the office you hold. And so my question is, how do we bring respect back into politics?
It's how you treat people. You know, it really, it's how you treat, somebody disagrees with you, it's not a big deal, right? So, I mean, I don't think it's complicated. It's not to me. It really isn't. And there's, you know, I enjoy the political process, the give and take, and people who disagree with me, you know. So it's not complicated. You know, what I did is no negative campaigns, no negative ads. I listen more than I talk, except for tonight. And you know, most of us have a story, and it's kind of interesting if you take some time to try to understand where that comes from. It's a part of life that actually is fun. You know, trying to hear about the other person and just take yourself out of it. So I actually think it's pretty easy. There's a lot of forces that make it hard. Social media, you know, Fox News. I mean, Tucker Carlson, disgraceful guy in my view, just a demagogue. So a good journalist who's balanced, who listens. So, you know, most of us don't really enjoy that kind of adversarial personality attacking kind of individual. So anyway, that's my.
all right. Deb, you want to go down right down here?
Thank you so much, Senator. So just going back to the issue of democracy and all these issues and the war in Ukraine and conflicts in other countries, do you feel the responsibility to protect democracy in other countries? And what is your view on the development of that trend in the future?
Well, I think that the U.S. Should live its values at home and abroad. So we should be standing up for democracy abroad. But, you know, we can't impose ourselves in other countries. We don't have that control, but I think we can do our best to be an example. And I do think we have to be very engaged. This goes back to your earlier questions. It's one thing to get involved in a war. I mean, I guess you can call that being engaged, right? But usually destructive and dead end. But we should be much more diplomatically engaged, much more diplomatically engaged. And you know, there's this, we're going to have $1 trillion military budget. The State Department budget's not at all keeping up with it. And diplomacy matters, the engagement matters. So I want us to be involved, but war is not the answer in most of these things. And you know, Ukraine is an exception for me versus the other conflicts, but we're not directly involved. We're very supportive, obviously, of Ukraine, but that's when they've been invaded.
All right. I think we have time for 2 more, if they're very quick. Do you want to go right up there first?
Great to hear from you today, Senator. Just had a quick question for you. I'm wondering why you think you won that first campaign back in 1980 for state senate in a year that was pretty big for
I had
Republicans.
so much fun. You know what I did? We have it was surprise. In Windsor County, you guys don't know where Vermont is, even though you've heard of it.
It's the land across the river.
It's the land across the river. But Vermont was quite conservative, and we had a 3-person district. Yeah, so 3 senators were elected from Windsor County. So I realized that if I was your second choice or your third choice, that was as good as being your first choice. So I got in my car and I spent 3 months going to every chicken pie supper. I went to high school football games. I'd go to the post office on Saturday. I'd go to the country store on Sunday when people were coming in to get their papers. And at the end of it, I'd met so many people were getting sick of me, all right? And, and I did have an insight that it wasn't so much about the issues. Because when I got out, I'm shaking hands with somebody, it's like they just wanted to have some sense that they kind of liked you or thought you were okay. And just to give you an example of how this is, I'm saying a bad thing about myself, but I remember I was in Chester, Vermont, and I couldn't believe it, but everybody going in was asking me what my position was on doe season. And do you know what, do you have a position on doe season? All right, well, this was a big deal for Vermonters. And I was as clueless about doe season as you were. So I'm coming home after my campaigning and I'm talking to my family. And I'm saying it was amazing. 13 people asked me, what my position was on doe season. And then, they're kind of wondering about doe season. And that's whether you can shoot does as opposed to bucks, all right? Which I didn't know at the time. And I said, well, I was for it 7 times and against it 6. But, mainly I just listened. And what I found is that it's we all need to be heard, don't we? We do. We want to. So, and it goes to your question. If you feel heard, then you can live with you disagree. You might not vote for me, but it's not like you're going to be angry. You're having some. If you have some sense that I actually listened to what you listened, didn't just pretend to listen, then that's what makes the world go round. It really does. So a lot of this stuff is just interpersonally really simple, but that's what it was. So I worked hard. I got out. I understood that what was going to be important to people was them leaving an interaction with me, having some sense that I cared about them. At a local race, state senate, that changes sometimes if there's some issue on the ballot and everybody wants to know are you for this or that. But I think that's the key.
All right.
Listening matters, it really does.
All right, I think we've got time for one more.
Thank you so much, Senator. So Migrant farm workers in Vermont, many of whom are from Latin America and some of whom are undocumented, form a real backbone of many of the dairy farms in your
Right.
state. And so I'm curious, with your move to the U.S. Senate, what conversation, or have you been having conversations with senators from, say, the West and from the South about immigration policies and what they should look like there? And if you haven't been having those conversations, could you articulate what your vision for our modern day immigration policies should be, both for the southern border
Yeah.
and the northern border as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked that. Well, first of all, we're so totally dependent on migrant labor here. And I think the migrant labor here who's keeping the cows being milked, picking the apples, doing lots of incredibly important work, should have full confidence they can live in the daylight, not in the shadows. I went to a health clinic over in Middlebury that was sort of underground and now is above ground, and it was just so in the farmers and their workers were there, but they are, you obviously know this, but there's an immense amount of anxiety that folks have that if they go through a stop sign, suddenly they're going to be deported. The second thing that's bad is that a lot of these families that are here, if they have a death in the family back in Mexico, they can't go. They're fearful about coming back in the current environment. And I think there's got to be a much more secure situation for folks who are working here with the H-2B visas, okay? So my view is that we've got to have respect for the folks who are doing work that's really essential and wouldn't be done without them. The immigration issue is been a political device that Trump has really intensified. We've got a couple of different elements. We have legal immigration, and there should be more of it, in my view. You've got the specialized H-2A, H-2B, the special ability people and a lot of farm workers, and I think that should be increased. We need it. And the second thing is that the folks who are here shouldn't be afraid to be here. Third, we've got the dreamers, and that's the kids who've come over with their parents. A lot of times they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. A lot of those have gone on to college. I met one that I invited to join me at one of the Obama State of the Union addresses, graduated from med school at UVM, and they need a status. They're entitled to status, and it's outrageous that they don't have it. And then the hard part are the folks that are showing up at the border, and that has really changed. There's like over 2 million people showed up last year at the southern border. We're starting to get some at the northern border. And there is a lot of other factors that are going into that. It used to be mostly from Mexico and then from the Triangle states and Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador, or pardon me, Guatemala. Now it's failed states. It's Nicaragua, it's Venezuela. 25% of the people of Venezuela have fled the country, okay? And Haiti, obviously, incredible challenges there, but you've got failed states, and you've got climate refugees. And that is a real challenge for us because the capacity to accommodate folks who are they're fleeing persecution, and there's asylum categories that entitle people to a hearing and possibly asylum status. But there's also a lot of folks who probably don't fit in that strict legal definition, but are really desperate. I mean, can you imagine what it takes to leave Venezuela and walk from there, and it is walking for a lot of folks, through the Darien Gap? And I mentioned I went down to South America, and I hitchhiked, okay? Most of the way, took buses, took some trains. When I got to Costa Rica, I was not going through the Darien Gap. You can't do it. And you have families coming up. I mean, it's just astonishing. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge for us. But what's really discouraging to me right now is that the issue became something that was highly politicized, where I think when Trump got in, he really didn't want a solution because it was much more effective for him to use it as an issue. You know, we came close to getting a comprehensive immigration bill passed. Senator Leahy voted for it. Senator McCain voted for it. It came to the House. I was ready to vote for it. And then Speaker Boehner never brought it up. So that's kind of an outline of what the issues are. And you're hearing also my apprehension about our capacity to get some resolution.
All right. With that, I think we have run out of time for this event.
Great.
So I'd like to thank Senator Peter Welch one more time.
Thank you.